On February 3, 1978, in the industrial town of Perm, on the edge of the Ural Mountains, a man named Viktor Sokolov arrived for his morning shift at the automobile repair depot where he had worked for nearly 14 years. He was 36 years old, an ordinary mechanic in every possible sense. He lived in a cramped two-room apartment, took the same tram to work every morning, and spent his weekends repairing neighbors' cars for extra cash. To most people around him, Viktor was the definition of a Soviet everyman. Hard-working, quiet, invisible to the state, or so he believed. That morning, a thin layer of frost coated the depot's metal doors. Inside, the air smelled of old oil, gasoline, and the metallic tang of winter. Viktor clocked in, nodded to his supervisor, and walked toward his workbench. Everything seemed normal until he noticed something unusual. A pair of unfamiliar black Volga sedans parked behind the depot. Government vehicles, the kind no one asked questions about. At first, Viktor assumed they belonged to some visiting party official, someone coming to inspect the depot. But instead of going into the main office, he saw three men in long gray coats stepping out from one of the cars. They weren't factory inspectors. Their movements were too controlled, their expressions too measured. Even from a distance, Viktor recognized exactly who they were: KGB. The sight of them made him pause mid-step, a wrench dangling in his hand. In a town like Perm, everyone had heard stories about the KGB visiting workplaces, someone being taken away without warning, someone who disappeared for months, sometimes forever. But Viktor had never imagined they would show up at his depot. Nothing ever happened at the depot. Nothing important, nothing political, nothing dangerous. He tried to dismiss it, tried to focus on his work, but as the men entered the building, speaking briefly with the supervisor before heading deeper inside, a tightness formed in his chest. He watched them walk past the workbenches, pausing occasionally, observing the workers with the kind of scrutiny that made even innocent men feel guilty. Viktor kept his eyes low, pretending to work on the engine in front of him. He had nothing to hide. He told himself that over and over. But the KGB men didn't come to him. They didn't come to any worker on the floor. Instead, after several minutes, they walked through the hallway that led toward the back offices, toward the spare parts room, toward the small desk where Viktor's younger brother Leonid worked as the depot's inventory clerk. A cold feeling washed over Viktor. He straightened up slowly, watching as the three men disappeared into Leonid's workspace. For a moment, the shop fell silent, except for the buzzing of fluorescent lights and the metallic echoes of someone dropping a wrench on concrete. The men were inside for exactly 4 minutes. When they emerged, Leonid walked behind them, pale, stiff, and avoiding everyone's eyes. The KGB officers didn't touch him, didn't restrain him, didn't raise their voices. They simply gestured for him to follow. And he did, without a word. The supervisor came out shortly after, announcing to the stunned mechanics that everything was under control, that Comrade Sokolov had been called for questioning regarding a routine administrative matter, and that work should continue as usual. But nobody believed it. Everyone knew that questioning rarely meant anything routine. Viktor stood frozen, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it echoed in the empty spaces of the depot. He wanted to say something, to step forward, to demand an explanation, but he couldn't move. Even speaking could draw the wrong attention, and the KGB were not the kind of men you questioned.
By the time he reached the depot exit, the two black Volgas were already pulling away, engines rumbling softly as they disappeared down the snowy street. Viktor stared after them. unable to shake the memory of the look on Leonid's face. Shock, fear, but something else too. Something that unsettled him even more. It wasn't confusion, and it wasn't surprise. It was recognition, as if Leonid had been expecting this, as if this moment had been waiting for him for a long time. That was the instant when something inside Victor shifted, when a suspicion he would never have dared to say aloud, not even to himself, began to take form. Because over the past months, he had noticed things: strange conversations, late-night visitors, neighbors suddenly treated differently by local authorities. And always, somehow, Leonid seemed to know things before they became public. Things about people, things that no ordinary clerk should know. And now, as Victor walked back into the depot, forcing himself to return to his workbench, one terrible question began echoing in his mind. What if his own brother had been informing on people? What if the KGB hadn't come to accuse Leonid of something, but to thank him? That evening, Victor walked home through the narrow streets of Perm with his collar pulled high against the cold wind. The lamps along the sidewalk buzzed faintly, casting long, pale shadows that made the city feel emptier than usual. Normally, he would have stopped at the small convenience kiosk near his apartment block to buy bread or cigarettes, but today his mind was too clouded to think about routine. When he reached his building, a gray 5-story Khrushchevka with cracked concrete and drafty stairwells, he hesitated before climbing the stairs. His apartment was on the 2nd floor. Leonid lived on the 4th, and for the first time in years, Victor found himself staring up the stairwell, wondering if he should go check the door, see if anyone had been inside, see if anything had been taken. But he stopped himself. Curiosity could be dangerous. Walking around, asking questions, even appearing too interested in someone who had been taken, that was enough to draw suspicion of its own. He forced himself to go to his own apartment instead. He heated a small pot of soup on the stove, but the smell made him nauseous. The silence felt heavier than usual, as if the walls themselves were listening. He kept replaying the moment the KGB had walked past him, the look on Leonid's face, the way his brother had kept his eyes fixed on the floor. There had been something there, something he understood only now. Leonid wasn't confused. He wasn't in shock. He looked guilty. Victor slept poorly, waking every hour to the distant rumble of trams or the sound of footsteps in the hallway. By morning, he felt like he hadn't slept at all. But he forced himself to go to work. He needed answers, and the depot was the only place where he might hear anything. When he arrived, the atmosphere was different. Conversations were muted. Workers stood in small clusters, speaking in cautious whispers. Everyone avoided the hallway near Leonid's office, as if walking past it might connect them to something dangerous. Victor went straight to his workbench. He didn't look at anyone, didn't ask questions, didn't show any expression that could be misinterpreted. He pretended everything was normal, but inside he felt a growing pressure, like a balloon swelling inside his chest until it was ready to burst.
It was nearly noon when his supervisor approached him, clearing his throat awkwardly. He said the depot had received official notice that Leonid would not be returning for several days. He did not specify why. He did not say where Leonid had been taken. He simply stated the words with the stiff tone of a man repeating instructions he had no intention of questioning. Then, almost as an afterthought, the supervisor added that the KGB had requested Leonid's desk remain untouched until further notice. That was when Victor felt the first true spike of fear. If it were routine questioning, they wouldn't seal his workspace. The rest of the day passed slowly. Victor's hands moved automatically, repairing engines and tightening bolts, but his mind wandered endlessly. He thought about Leonid as a child, quiet, observant, always cautious, even back then. He didn't cause trouble, didn't fight, didn't draw attention. He was the type of person the authorities liked, a rule follower, a listener, a watcher. By the time Victor finished his shift, an unsettling memory began creeping back, something he had forgotten, or perhaps avoided remembering. A few months earlier, one of their neighbors, an elderly man named Pavel, had been taken by the KGB. It had happened in the early morning while Victor was leaving for work. He saw two agents leading Pavel down the stairs, while his wife cried quietly in the doorway. Later that week, Leonid made an odd comment. He mentioned that Pavel had been complaining too loudly about shortages, that someone should have reported him long ago. And he said it with a tone that stuck with Victor even now, a tone of certainty, as if he already knew what Pavel had said, where he had said it, and who might have heard it. At the time, Victor dismissed it as Leonid repeating gossip. Everyone gossiped in Perm. It was how people survived the monotony. But now, hearing it again in his memory, the words felt different, deliberate. As Victor walked home that evening, he found himself stopping in front of the stairwell again. This time, he looked up toward the fourth floor, toward Leonid's apartment door that he knew would be sealed shut. He climbed the stairs slowly, hesitating with every step. When he reached Leonid's door, his breath caught. A thin strip of brown paper had been pasted across the doorframe, stamped with the emblem of the KGB, a seal that meant no one was to enter, no one was to touch anything inside. Breaking it would be a criminal offense. Victor stared at the seal for a long time. His heart pounded so loudly he could hear it in his ears. He wasn't supposed to be here. He knew that. Anyone passing by might see him standing outside a KGB sealed apartment, and that alone could lead to questions. But he couldn't move, because as he stared at the seal, he felt something like grief rising in his throat. Not just because his brother had been taken, but because a new thought, dark and unshakable, had begun to form. What if Leonid hadn't been arrested? What if he had been recruited? And what if this, his removal, his disappearance, was not punishment, but protection? Because if Leonid had been informing on their neighbors, on coworkers, on people Victor saw every day, then someone, somewhere, might now be informing on him. Victor backed away from the door and hurried down the stairs, pulse racing, suddenly aware of how thin the walls were, how many ears might be listening. For the first time in his life, he felt truly unsafe in his own building. And that was only the beginning. 2 days passed with no word about Leonid, no notice from the authorities, no knock on Victor's door, no explanation. But in the Soviet Union, silence was often more dangerous than noise. It meant decisions were being made behind closed doors. It meant your life could be changing without you knowing it. On the third morning, Victor woke to the sound of someone knocking on a door in the hallway. A sharp, deliberate knock. His breath caught for a moment, waiting to hear if it was his door. But it wasn't. The sound came from downstairs, followed by muffled voices, then footsteps climbing upward. He stood still, listening without moving, the way every Soviet citizen learned to listen. Quietly, carefully, pretending not to care, while caring completely. But the footsteps passed. His door remained untouched. Still, the moment stayed with him all morning. The tension in his body would not loosen. He kept replaying the thought that had hovered in his mind since he last stood outside Leonid's sealed apartment. If Leonid had been informing for the KGB, then Victor had lived next to a danger he never recognized, a danger he shared blood with. At the depot, the atmosphere grew only more oppressive. Workers spoke in forced smiles and hushed tones. Some avoided Victor entirely. Others looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and fear, as if guilt might be contagious. In the Soviet Union, association mattered. If a brother disappeared, the shadow sometimes fell on the entire family. About an hour before lunch, Victor was tightening bolts on a truck engine when he noticed someone approaching from the corner of his eye. It was Sergei, one of the younger mechanics. He glanced around the workshop nervously before leaning closer. "Listen," Sergei murmured, quietly, pretending to examine Victor's tools. "I didn't tell you this, understand?" Victor nodded once. "Someone saw Leonid 2 nights ago, at the municipal office building, not in custody, walking freely, with a KGB officer." Victor froze. "With?" he repeated, trying to keep his voice steady. Sergei nodded. "Not being escorted, walking beside him, talking, as if—" he hesitated, "as if they knew each other." For a moment, Victor felt the world shrink around him. The sounds of the depot, clanging metal, hissing air compressors, footsteps, faded into the background. He tried to swallow, but his throat was dry. "Who told you that?" Victor asked. Sergei shook his head. "Too dangerous to say, and you shouldn't ask." Then he walked away quickly, leaving Victor staring down at the engine with trembling hands. The thought returned, sharper now, undeniable. Leonid wasn't a victim of the KGB. He was working with them.
That night, Victor couldn't bring himself to go straight home. Instead, he took a walk through the icy streets, letting the wind bite at his face. He passed the neighborhood shops, the old cinema, the empty bus stop. Everywhere he looked, it felt like the city was watching him back. Eventually, he made his way toward the apartment block where Pavel's widow lived, the old man who had been taken months ago. He remembered how Leonid had spoken about him afterwards, almost with satisfaction. Victor hesitated outside her door, unsure of what he planned to do. He wasn't allowed to knock, not after what had happened, but he lingered in the hallway, listening to the quiet, trying to decide if he could bring himself to walk away. Then, suddenly, the door opened. Pavel's wife stood there holding a bag of trash, ready to take it downstairs. When she saw Victor, she paused, surprised. She looked tired, thinner than before, her eyes sunken with grief. "Oh," she said softly. "Victor." He forced a polite smile. "Good evening." She nodded but didn't return the smile. She looked at him with an expression he hadn't expected, wariness, fear even, as if she wasn't sure standing near him was safe. Victor realized in that moment what she must be thinking. Her husband had been taken. Now Victor's brother had been taken, or had disappeared. That was enough for suspicion to spread like cold wind through the building. Guilt by association was a powerful, silent force. He stepped aside so she could pass. But as she walked by, she said something under her breath, something he wasn't meant to hear, something that made Victor's blood run cold. "They always knew," she murmured. "Someone told them everything." Victor turned. "What?" She froze, realizing she had spoken too loudly. Her hand tightened around the trash bag handle. "I didn't mean," she stammered. "Please forget it."
But Victor shook his head slowly. "You think someone told the KGB about Pavel." She looked at him with a pained expression. Then she spoke in a whisper so faint it barely rose above the creak of the hallway. "Pavel said things only at home, only to me, only in these walls. No one else could have heard." Her lip trembled. "But Leonid, he visited once, just once, to borrow a wrench, and after that—" She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. Victor felt the floor tilt beneath him. He knew then, with a terrible certainty, that the truth he had been avoiding was real. Leonid had been informing on their neighbors. He had been informing on people Victor knew, people he saw every Sunday at the market, people who had lent him tools or shared meals with him or stood beside him in freezing lines for bread. And if Leonid had spoken to the KGB,
what had he said about Victor? The realization hit him so hard he had to grip the railing to steady himself. His breath came fast and shallow. Suddenly, the roles were reversed. His brother wasn't the one in danger. He was. That night, Victor's apartment felt colder than usual. He locked the door, checked the window latches twice, then turned off every light except the one over the kitchen table. He sat there for a long time, staring at the worn wooden surface as if it might reveal something he had missed. His mind was racing, from Leonid's strange visits, to Pavel's disappearance, to the sealed apartment door upstairs, to Sergei's whispered warning. Every piece of the puzzle pointed in the same direction, but Victor still couldn't understand one thing. Why him? Why would Leonid involve his own brother in something so dangerous? Why would he allow secrecy and suspicion to creep into their family without warning? Had Leonid ever cared for him at all? Or was Victor simply another citizen to watch, another file to fill, another voice to record? The thought made Victor's chest tighten. He wanted answers, but the truth was far more dangerous than ignorance. He spent the next few days living in a constant state of vigilance. Every knock in the hallway made him freeze. Every unexpected footstep felt like a warning. His coworkers kept their distance, offering curt nods instead of conversation. And in the quiet corners of the depot, whispers followed him like shadows. Some of the men believed Leonid had been arrested. Others believed he had been recruited, but all of them believed the same thing. Victor might be next. On the 5th day, Victor returned home to find a small slip of paper underneath his door. He froze with his key halfway into the lock. Random notes were rare in the Soviet Union. Anonymous notes were dangerous. He bent down slowly, heart pounding, and picked it up. There were only 5 words, written in neat, almost delicate handwriting. He wants to speak to you. No signature, no address, no time. Just the message. Victor looked up and down the hallway. It was empty. His instinct told him to throw the note away, burn it, pretend he had never seen it. But curiosity and fear pulled him in the opposite direction. He slid the note into his coat pocket and locked the door behind him. An hour passed, then another. Victor paced the apartment, unable to stay still. He kept rereading the note, tracing the letters as if they might reveal something more. But there was nothing. Just a summons. At nearly 11 o'clock, he finally heard footsteps outside his door. One set, slow, steady. The sound stopped directly in front of him. Then, a soft knock. Not the heavy, authoritative KGB knock he had imagined, but something else, familiar, hesitant. Victor approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" he whispered. A pause. Then a voice he knew too well. "It's me," Leonid said quietly. "Please, open the door."
For a moment, Victor couldn't move. The room spun. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle. When he opened the door, he saw his brother standing there, pale, weary, and dressed in the same clothes he had worn the day he was taken. Except now, something in his expression had changed. His eyes were sharper, his posture straighter, and behind that, a kind of exhausted acceptance. Victor stepped aside to let him in. Leonid entered slowly, looking around the apartment as if it were a place he had once known, but no longer belonged to. He sat at the kitchen table without being asked. Victor closed the door behind them and turned the lock. For several long seconds, neither brother spoke. Finally, Victor broke the silence. "What happened to you?" Leonid stared at the tabletop for a moment. Then he exhaled. "I wasn't arrested," he said softly. "I was taken for briefing." Victor felt something inside him drop. "Briefing?" he repeated. "For what?" Leonid lifted his head. "For work." A cold shiver ran down Victor's spine. "What work?" Leonid looked at him with an expression Victor had never seen before, something like shame and pride woven together. "I've been assisting the committee for several years," he said, "providing information, observations, reports." He said the words as if describing a simple errand, as if it were ordinary, routine, necessary. Victor felt the air leave his lungs. "You been informing on people?" he whispered. "On our neighbors, our coworkers?" Leonid didn't answer immediately. Instead, he folded his hands on the table, calm and deliberate. The state needs people it can trust, people who can see what others cannot, people who understand their responsibility to protect the country from destabilizing influences. Victor stared at him in disbelief. "Destabilizing?" he snapped. "Pavel was an old man who complained about bread shortages. How was he a threat to anyone?" Leonid's jaw tightened. Discontent spreads. One voice becomes many. And when many start questioning the party, everything begins to fracture. My reports prevent that. I help ensure stability. Victor felt sick. "You destroy people. You ruin lives. For stability?" Leonid looked away. "I didn't come here to argue with you," he murmured. "I came to warn you." The words froze Victor where he stood. "Warn me?" he whispered. Leonid nodded. "There's a file on you now. Your name came up. Someone mentioned that you've been asking questions, standing outside my door, speaking with Pavel's widow." Victor's heart pounded painfully in his chest. "I didn't do anything," he said, voice cracking. "That doesn't matter," Leonid replied. "Perception matters, curiosity matters, and someone has noted yours." Victor leaned heavily against the counter, dizzy. "What do I do?" he asked.
For the first time that night, Leonid's expression softened. He reached out, placing a hand on his brother's arm. "Do nothing," he said. "Keep your head down. Say nothing to anyone. Don't ask questions. Don't speak to people you shouldn't. And above all," he hesitated, "don't mention this conversation." Victor stared at him, stunned at the cold pragmatism in his tone. "And what about you?" he whispered. "What happens to you now?" Leonid stood from the table slowly, pulling on his coat. "I will be reassigned," he said, "temporarily. They need distance between us. It's for your protection as much as mine." Victor felt tears burn in his eyes despite himself. "So that's it?" he said. "That's who you are?" Leonid paused at the door. "I serve the state," he said quietly, "even when it costs me everything else. He opened the door halfway, then stopped, as if a final thought had just come to him. "You're my brother, Victor. That's why I came tonight. Most people never get a warning." And then he stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. Victor stood alone in his small kitchen, staring at the silent door, feeling the weight of a truth he could never unlearn. His brother was not missing, not punished, not threatened. His brother was part of the machine, and Victor now understood what it meant to live in a country where even family could become the eyes and ears of the state, a place where trust was a luxury no one could afford. And from that night on, Victor learned how to live with the knowledge that changed his life forever. Sometimes the greatest danger during the Cold War didn't come from foreign enemies. It came from the person sitting across your own kitchen table.